They had grown up together. Nadia had spent 17 years believing Callum Voss was hers, sitting beside him at pack meetings, training in his shadow, building a future out of the certainty that the bond would confirm what she already knew. Everyone said so. His mother, her father, the entire Ironveil pack, who had watched them move through childhood and adolescence like two wolves who had already decided. Then the bonding ceremony arrived, and in front of 300 witnesses, Callum Voss looked at her across the sacred circle, curled his lip, and said 4 words that rearranged everything she thought she was. "I reject you, Nadia." He did not lower his voice. He did not look away. He said it the way you said something you had been rehearsing. Clean, final, requiring no response. He was already turning towards Seraphine Aldrich before the echo died. Now Nadia stood in the silence that followed and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she had 2 choices. She could shatter. She could give him and every witness in that hall exactly what they were waiting for. The collapse, the begging, the proof that she had needed him more than he had ever needed her. Or she could do the thing no rejected wolf had ever done in the history of Ironveil pack. She lifted her chin. She said quietly and without trembling, "I accept." And she turned and walked toward the door. She almost made it. Chapter 1. The Wound. The bonding ceremony of Ironveil pack was held in the great hall of the Elder Stone, a building that had stood for 4 centuries and had absorbed, in that time, the emotional residue of every significant moment the pack had ever produced. Mating bonds confirmed, alphas crowned, wolves mourned. The stone walls held all of it, and on the night of a bonding ceremony, with 300 candles burning in their iron brackets and 300 wolves assembled in their formal positions, the hall felt exactly like what it was, the most consequential room in the territory. Nadia had dressed carefully. Not for Callum. She understood that now, in retrospect, though she had not understood it while she was doing it. She had dressed carefully because she understood ceremony, because she respected what the hall represented, because she was the kind of person who showed up to important moments fully prepared, regardless of what those moments cost her. The dress was deep green, the color of the Ironveil forest in summer. Her dark hair was pinned at the nape of her neck. The pressed wildflower, the small, flattened thing she had carried in her pocket since she was 7 years old, since the afternoon she had found it growing through a crack in the pack house wall and had pressed it between the pages of a book and kept it for reasons she had never been able to fully articulate, sat against her hip through the fabric of her dress. She had carried it to every important moment of her life. She had not thought, dressing for this one, that she would need it for the reason she had originally pressed it. For comfort, for the reminder of who she was before the world started defining her by her proximity to other people's decisions. She had thought tonight would be a beginning. As she stood in the sacred circle and looked at Callum Voss across the candle-lit space between them, and felt the familiar certainty of 17 years settle around her like something earned. He was handsome in the way she had always known him to be, broad-shouldered, amber-eyed, carrying his future alpha status in the set of his jaw. She had grown up beside this person, had trained beside him, eaten beside him, mapped her future around his presence with the unthinking confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt the foundations of what they are building on. She smiled at him across the circle. He did not smile back. She noticed this. She cataloged it. She told herself it was nerves, that even Callum Voss, who had never visibly suffered a moment of uncertainty in all the years she had known him, could be nervous on a night like this. Elder Marin stepped forward and began the invocation. Nadia watched Callum's face through the words, the lighting of the bonding candle, the recitation of the old covenant. She watched him the way she had always watched him, with the attentiveness of someone who had made another person the center of their attention for so long that attentiveness had become a reflex rather than a choice. His eyes were not on her. They had not been on her since she entered the hall. She felt the first tremor of something cold move through the certainty in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of pressing your weight onto a floorboard you have crossed 1,000 times and feeling, for the first time, the faint flecks of something that might not hold. Elder Marin reached the declaration. The hall went very quiet. Callum turned to face her fully for the first time since the ceremony began. His expression was composed, resolved. It was the expression of a man who had made a decision and had made his peace with the cost of it. The expression, she would later understand, of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in private and was now simply executing it. I reject you, Nadia. The words landed without preamble, without softening. 300 wolves drew a collective breath that became, immediately, a collective silence so total she could hear the candle flames. You were convenient, he continued, and his voice was measured, almost gentle, which was worse than anger would have been. A childhood habit I mistook for a bond. What I feel for Seraphine is what a real mate bond is supposed to feel like. Now you know the difference. He said the last sentence like a gift, like he was offering her something useful. The pressed wildflower burned cold against her hip. Nadia stood in the sacred circle and felt the words move through her and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that the cold thing in her chest was not grief. Not yet. It was something closer to recognition. The specific sensation of a structure you have been living inside, suddenly revealing that it was never as solid as it appeared, and that some part of you, some deep and honest part, had always known. She looked at Callum Voss, at the man who had just called her a childhood habit in front of every wolf in Ironveil, and she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that he had known for longer than tonight, that the resolution in his expression was not the resolution of a man making a difficult choice, but the resolution of a man concluding a difficult period of private deliberation. She understood that Seraphine, who stood at the edge of the sacred circle with her eyes already bright, had been the answer he had arrived at some time ago. She understood that she had been the last person in the hall to know any of this, and she understood, with the particular precision of someone who had spent 17 years making themselves useful and accommodating and easy to keep, that she had two choices. She could give the hall what it was waiting for, the collapse, the begging, the public demonstration of how much she had needed him. She could make her devastation into a spectacle that would be discussed for years in the language of pity, or she could refuse. The wildflower pressed against her hip. Small, flattened, persistent. She thought about the girl who had kept it. 7 years old, finding something beautiful growing through a crack in the wall, deciding it was worth preserving before anyone told her whether it was or wasn't. She lifted her chin. I accept. 2 words, completely level. Not performed. She had not planned them, had not rehearsed this response because she had not imagined needing it. They arrived from somewhere beneath the architecture of everything Callum had built around her, and they sounded, even to her own ears, like something that had always been there. She turned. She walked toward the door. 300 wolves parted for her in silence. Not out of respect. Not yet. Out of the specific bewilderment of witnesses who had prepared themselves for one kind of scene and received another entirely, and who did not yet know what to do with the difference. She kept her shoulders back and her pace steady and her eyes on the door at the far end of the hall, and she told herself that she only needed to reach it, that everything after the door was survivable, that she simply needed to reach it. She almost did. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Offer. The hand that closed around the door before she could open it was not Callum's. She knew this immediately, knew it by the size of it, by the particular stillness with which it moved, by the way the wolves nearest the door stepped back without being asked, which was the specific behavior of wolves in the presence of someone whose authority required no announcement. She stopped. She looked up. Aldrich Kane was not what the stories described, and the stories were not small. The Alpha King of Ironveil Court was spoken of in Ashvale the way distant weather was spoken of, as something that existed at a remove significant enough that its precise nature was less important than its general direction and scale. Powerful. Controlled. The kind of ruler who had held the largest territory on the continent for 12 years without losing either ground or the particular quality of stillness that distinguished authority from performance. He was taller than she had registered from across the hall. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, dressed in the deep charcoal of Ironveil Court, with no ornamentation except the seal ring on his right hand that every wolf on the continent would have recognized. He was looking at her with an expression that was not pity and not curiosity, and not the particular fascinated discomfort of someone watching a scene they had not anticipated. He was looking at her like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had positioned himself accordingly. "Walk out of here as my intended," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "And no pack on this continent will touch you. Walk out alone, and Ashvale will make what just happened look like kindness." Nadia looked at him. Behind her, she could feel the hall's attention like a physical pressure. 300 wolves who had just watched something unprecedented and were now watching something more unprecedented still. She did not turn around. "Why?" she said. It was not precisely a question. It was the kind of flat single syllable that requested a more complete accounting. "Because I can," he said. Then, after a pause, "And because what just happened in that circle was an offense to the ceremony, to this hall, and to the covenant. I have jurisdiction, as Alpha King, to respond to violations of Pact Covenant law. I am choosing to respond this way. That is the political answer, she said. Something moved in his expression, brief, controlled, almost imperceptible. It is the answer available to me right now. She studied him for a moment longer. The hall was utterly silent behind her. She was aware of Callum somewhere in it, could feel the mate bond's severed edge like a phantom limb, at present in its absence, and she was aware that every second she stood at this door was a second the hall spent constructing a narrative about her that she would have to live inside afterward. 2 conditions, she said. His eyes sharpened slightly. Name them. I will not be used as a political instrument. If this arrangement serves your court's purposes, I require full disclosure of how and the right to refuse any action that compromises my own interests. Agreed. And when this arrangement concludes, on whatever terms we establish, I leave with my freedom fully intact. No pact claim, no bond obligation, no condition on my movements or my future. He held her gaze. Agreed. In writing, she said, under your seal, before we leave this territory. You will have it. She looked at him for one more moment, at the stillness of him, the complete absence of the particular anxiety that motivated most of the things most wolves did. And she made her decision not from hope, which she had temporarily retired, but from the cold, clear logic of a woman who had just been told, in front of everyone she knew, that she was a habit. A habit had nothing left to lose by making unusual choices. She took his arm. The hall erupted. Not in sound, in movement, the specific ripple of 300 wolves turning to each other in the same instant. The collective recalibration of a room that had expected 1 story and received 3. Nadia did not look back. She walked beside Aldrich Kane toward the door and felt the wildflower in her pocket and felt, beneath the cold clarity of the last 10 minutes, something small and tentative that she was not ready to name. At the door, Aldrich paused, just for a moment. He looked back across the hall, and she did not need to follow his gaze to understand it, because she felt the shift in the arm beneath her hand, the infinitesimal tightening of a man exerting control over something he would not permit himself to express. She did not look back, but she filed that moment away very carefully. Chapter 3. The Performance. Ironveil Court was 3 days' travel from Ashvale, and in those 3 days Nadia slept in a private carriage, ate at a separate table from the king's party, and spoke to Aldrich exactly 4 times. Each exchange brief, practical, and concluded before it could become anything else. She was performing distance. She understood this about herself without judgment. Distance was the architecture she defaulted to when the alternative was feeling something she had not yet built adequate structure to contain. Ironveil itself arrived in stages. First the territory's signature dark pine forest, then the river, then the outer walls of the court complex rising from the valley floor, with the particular authority of something that had been standing long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The court was old in the way that truly powerful things were old. It did not announce itself. It simply was. Her rooms were in the east wing, large, warm, facing the gardens. Nothing about them resembled the servant's wing. Nothing about any of this resembled anything she had prepared herself for. She unpacked methodically and began. The performance, in practice, looked like this. She appeared at court functions composed and precise. She sat beside Aldrich at formal dinners and engaged the assembled wolves with the particular combination of warmth and intelligence that she had spent years developing in Ashevale, and which translated, she discovered, considerably better in a court that valued acuity over compliance. She deflected personal questions with wit that was dry enough to be armor and light enough to pass as charm. She watched Aldrich navigate his court with the focused attention of someone who understood that observing powerful people carefully was the most useful skill available to the powerless, and she catalogued what she observed. He was, she noted, nothing like what she had expected. She had expected performance, the elaborate staging of authority that lesser alphas engaged in, the raised voices, the deliberate displays of dominance. Aldrich Kane governed by the opposite principle. He spoke quietly and required people to lean in to hear him, which reorganized every room he entered without a single raised hand. He turned his back on wolves he had dismissed from his attention. He listened to advisors he disagreed with all the way to the end of their argument before responding, which was more unsettling than interruption would have been, because it left no room for the claim of being misunderstood. He introduced her, at the first formal dinner, as Nadia, who requires no further qualification. The court did not know what to do with this. She watched them not know what to do with it, and found, unexpectedly, that she did not mind being the thing they were uncertain about. It was a different quality of uncertainty than she had been in Ashevale. There, uncertainty about her had been the uncertainty of people deciding how little she mattered. Here, it was the uncertainty of people trying to calculate how much. Proximity to him was the problem she had not fully accounted for. Not because he was inappropriate. He was scrupulously appropriate, maintaining exactly the formal distance the arrangement required, never touching her beyond the arm she took at public entrances, never speaking to her in private in a register that differed from the one he used in court. The problem was more subtle than that. The problem was the gap between what he performed and what she occasionally caught beneath it. The jaw that tightened once at breakfast on the fourth morning. The way his attention reorganized itself when she entered a room he was already in. The particular quality of his listening when she spoke, that was different from his listening when anyone else spoke, and which she kept telling herself she was imagining. She was not imagining it. She knew she was not imagining it. She told herself she was imagining it anyway, because the alternative required her to be feeling something she had not given herself permission to feel yet, and she was not ready. The news about Callum arrived at the end of the first week. It came from one of Aldrich's border scouts, a routine report that included, almost as an afterthought, the observation that a wolf matching the description of Ashevale's rejected alpha heir had been seen at the territory borders 3 times in 4 days, asking questions about the composition of the Ironveil party that had attended the bonding ceremony. Nadia received this information at breakfast. She poured herself more tea. She set the pot down. She did not react. Across the table, Aldrich watched her do this, He said nothing. He returned to his correspondence. But she felt his attention remain on her for several seconds after his eyes had moved away, and she pressed her hand briefly against the wildflower in her pocket and told herself firmly that she was not moved by that. She was somewhat moved by that. The villain returned in smaller form that week, not Callum himself, but his name, dropped into her presence 3 times by court wolves who she was fairly certain had not done it accidentally. She deflected each instance with the same technique. Complete non-reaction followed by a subject change so smooth it denied the mention any oxygen. By the 3rd occurrence, she had perfected it. Aldrich noticed. She could tell by the way he did not comment on it. The specific, weighted quality of a man choosing not to say something he had clearly noticed. "You are very good at that," he said on the 7th evening as they walked back from the formal dinner through the east corridor. "At what?" she said. "Refusing to give people the reaction they came for?" She considered this. "I had a good teacher," she said. "Who?" he said. "Everyone who ever expected me to collapse," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They reached the junction where the corridor split toward her wing and his. He stopped. She stopped. "Good night, Nadia," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked to her rooms and sat on the edge of the bed and took the wildflower from her pocket and held it in her palm and thought about the girl who had pressed it. 7 years old, finding something worth keeping, trusting her own instinct about its value before anyone else had weighed in. She was beginning, slowly and with considerable caution, to trust that instinct again. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Armor. The storm arrived on the 19th night without warning. Not the gradual build of an autumn storm approaching from the north, the kind that gave wolves time to feel it in their bones and prepare accordingly, but the sudden, total kind that dropped from a clear evening sky in under an hour and turned the Ironveil gardens into a roaring dark, entirely unlike their daytime selves. Nadia had been in those gardens when it arrived. She had taken to walking there after the court retired, late enough that the paths were empty, early enough that she could call it an evening constitutional rather than what it actually was, which was an attempt to exhaust herself sufficiently to sleep without thinking about the things she spent her days not thinking about. The gardens were large and old, and planted with the particular density of something that had been growing undisturbed for generations, and at night they had a quality of privacy that her rooms, for all their comfort, did not quite provide. She had not made it back before the sky opened. She arrived at the east wing entrance soaked entirely through. Dress, hair, shoes, the pocket where the wildflower lived, and shaking with the specific full-body shaking of someone whose temperature had dropped below the threshold where dignity was a relevant consideration. Aldrich was in the corridor outside her door. He was not in court dress. He was in the plain, dark clothes of someone who had been in his private chambers and had come directly from them without stopping to consider appearances, which told her he had moved quickly, which told her something had brought him here before she had been expected to return. He looked at her. He did not ask what she had been doing in the gardens in an autumn storm. He did not ask why she had not returned when the weather turned. He did not perform the particular brand of concerned authority that powerful men sometimes performed when they wanted to establish that their concern was a form of ownership. He simply opened the door to her rooms and said, "Come in out of the corridor." He built the fire himself. She sat in the chair nearest the hearth, wrapped in the blanket he brought from the bed. Wool, heavy, smelling of cedar and something else she did not examine. And she watched him feed the fire with the methodical attention of someone who had decided this was the task at hand and was applying himself to it without hierarchy. And she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight since the bonding ceremony. He sat in the chair across from her when the fire was high enough. He did not speak. He watched her stop shaking with the patient attention of someone who was not leaving until he was certain she was no longer in danger, and who had no apparent interest in making this fact into a performance of any kind. The warmth arrived slowly, and with it, the lowering of the particular vigilance she maintained during daylight hours. The constant calibration of expression and response and safe distance that had become so habitual, she barely noticed it until it was briefly, unexpectedly absent. "I do not miss him," she said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived the way honest things sometimes arrived when the defenses were down, not as a decision, but as a fact presenting itself for acknowledgement. "That is the part I cannot explain," she continued, her voice quieter than she had intended. "I spent 17 years building a future around him, and I do not miss him at all. I think I miss who I was before I made him the center of everything, before I organized myself around what he needed and what he wanted, and what would make me easiest for him to keep." The fire crackled. Rain moved across the garden windows in sheets. "I think I pressed that wildflower when I was 7, she said, "because I knew, even then, that I was someone who noticed things worth keeping. And then I spent the next 10 years learning to notice only the things that were useful to someone else." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. "I have known who you were," he said, "since before you made him anything." She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the fire. His expression was the expression of a man who had said something he had been carrying for longer than the conversation, something that had emerged not from calculation, but from the specific exhaustion of holding it back one moment too many. He did not elaborate. He did not look at her. She looked at him for a long moment, at the stillness of him, the firelight, the plain dark clothes, the seal ring on his hand that represented more power than anyone in the room needed to reference. And she felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully not naming shift into a position where it was considerably harder to continue not naming. She fell asleep in the chair before she could decide what to do with that. When she woke, the fire had been kept banked. She could tell by the heat still high, which meant it had been tended recently. The chair across from her was empty. On the small table beside her, a cup of something warm and a folded piece of parchment bearing the Ironveil seal. She opened it. It was the written agreement of their arrangement, the one she had requested and not yet received. Both conditions documented precisely as she had named them. His signature at the bottom. She held it for a moment. Then she folded it and placed it carefully inside her dress, against her sternum, above the pocket where the wildflower lived, and she went to find breakfast before the court assembled, and before she had to decide what to do with the fact that she had told the Alpha King of Ironveil who she actually was, in the dark, beside a fire. And he had said, "I have known," as though it were something he had been waiting for permission to say for a very long time. Chapter 5. The Complication. Callum arrived on a Tuesday. Not at the borders this time. At the gates, formally, in Ashvale's diplomatic colors, with a letter of request addressed to the Alpha King's secretary that cited trade route negotiations as its purpose, and which everyone in Ironveil Court understood immediately was nothing of the kind. Aldrich granted the visit. He did not consult her. This was the first time in 5 weeks that he had made a unilateral decision about her movements, or about anything that directly concerned her, without at minimum informing her in advance. She received the news from his beta, Caius, over the morning briefing, and she received it with the same complete stillness she brought to all unwelcome information. And she waited until Caius had left the room before she sat with the particular quality of coldness that the decision had produced in her. She was not certain what it meant that it produced coldness rather than nothing. She thought about it while she dressed for the meeting. She examined it the way she examined most things she did not immediately understand, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion, giving it the space to reveal its actual shape rather than the shape she expected it to have. What she arrived at was this: the coldness was not about Callum. It was about the assumption embedded in the decision, the assumption that she could be managed, that her movements and her encounters could be arranged by someone else's judgment without her input, and that this was acceptable because the arrangement permitted it. She had spent 17 years being managed by the assumption that someone else's read of a situation was more valid than her own. She had not expected to encounter that particular architecture here. She wore it carefully through the meeting. Callum was in one of the smaller receiving rooms, a deliberate choice, she understood, that positioned him as a visitor rather than a guest. He stood when she entered. He looked at her the way she had never seen him look at her before, with the specific, slightly desperate attention of someone who had recently and painfully recalibrated their understanding of what they had dismissed. He was thinner, less certain in the jaw. "Nadia?" he said. "Callum," she said. She sat. He sat. She waited. He told her everything in the order she expected it. The speed of Seraphine's departure. 3 weeks after the ceremony, which meant, she noted without comment, that the passion he had described as the real thing had not outlasted the formality of the bond. The silence in the pack house afterward. The particular quality of absence that he had not anticipated, and which had clarified, in his description, exactly how little he had thought through the consequences of what he had done. He told her he had made a mistake. He told her he understood now what he had dismissed. He told her that what he had called a childhood habit had been, in fact, the thing itself. That he had confused familiarity with insufficiency, had mistaken depth for ordinariness, had reached past what was real for what was merely brighter, and paid the price that such choices always eventually produced. He asked her to come home. Nadia sat across from him and listened to all of it and waited for the thing she expected to feel. The vindication, the grief, the complicated tangle of relief and anger that she had imagined. On the nights when she had allowed herself to imagine it, this conversation might produce. She felt none of it. What she felt instead was something closer to pity, not performed, not chosen, simply the genuine response of someone looking at a person who had hurt them and finding where the wound had been only the clean scar of something that had healed in directions the injury had not predicted. "No," she said. He looked at her. "I am not coming home, Callum," she said. "Not because I am angry, not because I want you to understand how much you cost me, though you should understand that. I am not coming home because I am not the person you rejected anymore, and the person I am now does not belong in the place you are describing." She stood. "I hope you build something worth staying in," she said. "I mean that." She walked out. She walked down the main corridor toward the east wing, and she was almost at the junction when she heard voices from the courtyard entrance to her left. The courtyard where the visiting dignitaries' carriages were received, where the afternoon light came through the high archway and turned everything inside it gold. She glanced through the archway without meaning to. Aldrich was standing in the courtyard with a woman she did not recognize. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in the pale silver of what she thought might be Eastern Territory colors. The woman was laughing at something he had said, her hand on his arm, her face turned up toward his with the particular ease of someone entirely comfortable in the space she occupied. Aldrich was not laughing. He was doing the thing he sometimes did, the slight inclination of attention that indicated engagement without performance. He was not looking at the woman the way he looked at Nadia. She knew this. She registered it clearly and without self-deception. And yet the thing that moved through her chest as she watched was not nothing, and it was not ambiguous, and it required, she understood immediately, a very honest reckoning with what she had been telling herself for 5 weeks about what the arrangement was and what it was not. She walked to her rooms. She sat on the bed. She took the wildflower from her pocket and held it in both hands and had, for the first time since the bonding ceremony, the specific experience of feeling something she had not consented to feel moving through her with complete disregard for her preferences. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and began to pack. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. She told herself, as she folded each item with the precision of someone who needed her hands to be occupied, that this was the rational decision. The argument was clean. She had constructed it carefully during the hour between the courtyard and the decision to pack, and it held up under examination the way clean arguments did. Not because it was the whole truth, but because it was true enough. The whole truth was this. She had allowed the arrangement to become something it was not contracted to be. She had allowed proximity and firelight and the specific quality of his attention to erode the clarity she had arrived with, and she had arrived with very little to spare. She had come to Ironveil with nothing except 2 conditions and a pressed wildflower, and the cold understanding that she was not going to let anyone define her by their proximity again. And here she was, 5 weeks later, feeling something she had no right to feel about a man who had offered her protection in exchange for a political convenience, because a woman from the Eastern Territories had laughed at something he said and touched his arm. She recognized this pattern. She had spent 17 years inside a version of it. She was not going to spend another 5 weeks accumulating feelings she had not been invited to have until the arrangement concluded, and she was back where she started, only with a new set of ruins to navigate. She had her freedom as a condition. She was going to use it while she still could, while the leaving was a choice rather than a necessity. She wrote the letter at the small desk by the window, with the garden dark outside and the court quiet around her. She thanked him for the protection. She cited Callum's visit as evidence that the threat from Ashvale had resolved. He had come to Ironveil to negotiate her return, not to move against her, which meant his pride had already absorbed the blow and he would not escalate. The arrangement had therefore fulfilled its stated purpose. She was exercising her right to conclude it, as per the written agreement bearing his seal, which she folded inside the letter as proof of her good faith. She sealed the letter. She looked at the bag on the bed. 3 days of packing undone and repacked in an hour. The same cloth bag, the same spare life. She picked it up. She picked up the letter. She went to the door. The corridor was empty. She had chosen the hour carefully, late enough that the court had retired, early enough that the night guard rotation had not yet begun. She had 4 minutes, by her estimate, of completely unobserved corridor between her rooms and the east wing entrance. She had not accounted for him. He appeared at the far end of the corridor as she stepped out of her room. Not running, walking, with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. He was in plain dark clothes again, no court formality, the seal ring catching the low torchlight as he came toward her. She stopped. He stopped in front of her. His eyes went to the bag, to the letter in her hand. His letter, his seal visible on the fold, then to her face. "You are doing it again," he said. His voice was very quiet, not cold, something more complicated than cold. "Doing what?" she said. "Walking away before anyone can tell you that you were never convenient?" The corridor was still. The torches held their light. She looked at him, at the plain dark clothes, the steady eyes, the complete absence of performance, and felt the architecture she had constructed over the last hour begin to do the thing well-built arguments sometimes did when they encountered something they had not been designed to withstand. Not collapse, must simply reveal itself as insufficient. "I am exercising the terms of our agreement," she said. "I know," he said. "The arrangement has fulfilled its purpose." "I know," he said again. "Then step aside," she said. He did not step aside. He stood in the corridor and looked at her with the same directness he had looked at her with at the bonding ceremony door. Patient, unhurried, as though he had time that she did not, as though the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere earlier, and what was happening now was simply the arrival of that decision in the present. "I need you to hear something first," he said. The wildflower was in her pocket. She could feel it against her hip through the fabric. Small, flattened, persistent, 17 years of keeping it through everything. She looked at the man blocking her path and felt the thing in her chest that she had been refusing to name for 5 weeks settle into a position from which it could no longer be refused. "Then say it," she said. Chapter 7. The Truth Confession. He did not move from the corridor. He looked at her for a moment in the torchlight. And what she saw in his face was what she had occasionally caught glimpses of beneath the governance of his expression, and had always looked away from before she could be certain of what it was. She did not look away now. She looked at it directly, and what she saw was not the controlled authority of the Alpha King of Ironveil Court. It was something considerably older and less managed than that. "I was 11 years old," he said. She waited. "There was a diplomatic visit." "My father and yours?" "A border negotiation that took most of the day and involved a great deal of formal posturing that 11-year-olds are not required to participate in. I was left in the gardens of your pack house with my father's beta and approximately 4 hours to occupy myself." He paused. "There was a girl in the garden," he said. "Perhaps 7 or 8. She had found a wounded bird somewhere in the grounds. I could not tell you what kind, only that it was small and clearly not going to survive without intervention, and that this girl had caught it and was attempting to splint its wing with a twig and a strip of fabric she had torn from the hem of her dress." Something moved in Nadia's chest. "I stood at the garden wall for 20 minutes, he said. She did not know I was there. She was entirely focused on what she was doing, not performing it, not hoping for an audience, just doing it with the complete and patient attention of someone who had decided it was worth doing and was going to do it correctly regardless of how long it took. He looked at her. She had a wildflower in her pocket, he said. I saw it when she reached for the strip of fabric. She had pressed it flat, tucked it in there carefully, like something she was keeping. Nadia's hand went to her pocket without her deciding to move it. She felt the small, flat shape of it through the fabric. My father's beta came to collect me before I could speak to her, Aldrich said. I never learned her name. I never forgot her scent. The torchlight held still around them. I carried it for 20 years, he said. Not consciously, not as a decision, not as something I tended or returned to deliberately, simply as a presence. The way certain things stay with you, not because you chose to keep them, but because they lodged somewhere beneath the level of choice and remained. When I arrived at the Ironveil bonding ceremony as a political observer, I had no particular expectations for the evening. Bonding ceremonies were a formality. I attended them when protocol required it and left when protocol permitted it. He paused. And then you walked into the sacred circle, he said. And my wolf went completely silent. Nadia looked at him. I have not had a quiet wolf since I inherited this territory at 19 years old, he said. Every decision, every negotiation, every border dispute and council meeting and political calculation of the last 12 years has had the particular background noise of a wolf who is paying attention to threats and opportunities and the 1,000 variables of governing a territory this size. In the sacred circle at Ironveil, the noise stopped entirely. He said it simply, as a fact, without the vocabulary of romance or declaration, the way he said everything that mattered, as though the truth of something was sufficient and required no dressing. "I recognize the scent," he said. Not immediately. It took the length of the invocation. And then the recognition arrived, and with it the understanding that the girl at the garden wall and the woman in the sacred circle were the same person, and that I had been carrying her, without knowing it, for 20 years. Nadia's fingers pressed against the wildflower through her pocket fabric. "I watched Callum Voss reject you," he said, and something in his voice shifted on the name, tightened, briefly, then released. "I watched you accept it. I watched you lift your chin and say those 2 words and turn toward the door with your shoulders back and your pace steady. And I understood that if you walked out of that hall alone, you would disappear into something I had no right to intervene in and no grounds to follow." "So you intervened anyway," she said. "So I intervened anyway," he agreed, "with the only architecture available to me, which was the arrangement." "The arrangement was political cover?" she said. "The arrangement," he said, "was the only way I knew to stay near you without saying something I had no right to say to a woman who had just had her heart handled carelessly by someone else." The bag was still in her hand. She was aware of it, its weight, its implications, the clean logic of the argument she had packed it around. "The Eastern emissary," she said. "Means nothing," he said without hesitation. "Has never meant anything. I was aware you saw the courtyard, and I should have come to you immediately, and I did not, because I was managing the specific difficulty of watching Callum Voss sit across a table from you and not doing anything about it that I would have been entitled to do, even less than intervening at the door." "Your jaw tightened at breakfast," she said. "When Caius mentioned his name." "My jaw has been doing a great deal of tightening since this arrangement began," he said. "Largely in response to the idea of you returning to the man who called you a childhood habit in front of 300 witnesses, and then had the extraordinary arrogance to arrive at my court and ask for you back." Something that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath moved through her. "He is gone," she said. "I told him no." "I know," he said. "Caius told me. That is why I am in this corridor." She looked at him, at the plain dark clothes, the steady eyes, the seal ring, the 20 years of a girl at a garden wall carried without intention or performance, or the particular self-consciousness of someone who has decided their feeling is significant. She thought about the bird with the splinted wing. She thought about the twig and the strip of hem fabric and the complete and patient attention of doing something correctly because it was worth doing, regardless of who was watching. She thought about the wildflower in her pocket. She had pressed it because it was worth keeping, before anyone had told her whether it was or wasn't. Before Callum, before the ceremony, before 17 years of organizing herself around what was useful to someone else. She had known, at 7, what was worth keeping. She reached into her pocket. She took out the wildflower, the small, flat, faded thing, 20 years old, worn at the edges, and she held it in her open palm between them, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him. "You were at the wall," she said. "I was at the wall," he said. "I did not know." she said. No, he said. You were focused on the bird. She closed her hand around the wildflower. She set the bag down on the corridor floor. She took one step toward him, just one, measured, chosen, and she looked up at him with everything she had spent 5 weeks carefully not showing, and she said, quietly and without trembling, the same quality of voice she had used in the sacred circle when she said, I accept. Tell me about the bird. He told her. And later, much later, when the torches had burned lower and the corridor had been empty around them for a long time, she understood that the bravest thing she had done since the bonding ceremony was not walking away. It was putting the bag down. Epilogue. 9 months later. The gardens of Ironveil Court in early summer were exactly what Aldrich had told her they would be. Old, dense, growing with the particular confidence of something that had been undisturbed long enough to become itself entirely. The eastern wall was covered in the small yellow wildflowers he had described on the night of the corridor. The same variety, he had said. Whether this was true or whether he had arranged it, she had not asked and did not intend to ask, because some things were more valuable as the version they were offered as. She stood at the wall in the morning light with the pressed wildflower in her open palm. It had survived 20 years in her pocket, through 7-year-old certainty and adolescent hope, and 17 years of Callum and a bonding ceremony, and 3 days in a carriage, and 5 weeks of arrangement, and a corridor at midnight, and everything that had come after. Flattened, faded, the color almost entirely gone, but intact. She had carried it to know what she was before the world started defining her by other people's decisions. She had carried it as a reminder of the girl who noticed things worth keeping before anyone told her whether they were or weren't. She did not need it anymore. Not because that girl was gone, because she had found her way back to her, through the leaving and the arriving and the putting down of the bag, and she no longer needed the reminder that she had existed. She had evidence now. She was the evidence. She thought briefly of Callum, the way you thought briefly of things that had hurt you once and had healed into something instructive. Caius had brought the news 4 months ago, in the tone he used for information that was relevant but not urgent. Ashvale's council had moved against Callum's alpha claim following Seraphine's departure, and a series of border decisions that had cost the pack 2 allied territories. He now held a diminished claim on contested ground, with no political allies and no path back to what he had dismissed. She had received this information, noted it, and moved forward. There was nothing in it that required her. She set the wildflower on the top of the garden wall. Not thrown. Placed, with the same care she had placed it between the pages of a book 20 years ago. The same deliberateness of someone who understood that things that had served their purpose deserved a considered ending. It sat in the morning light, small and faded and intact, on the old stone wall of a court that had been standing long before either of them arrived at it. She heard the garden go quiet behind her. She knew that quality of quiet. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself one more moment with the wall and the morning and the thing she had set down. The full understanding of what she was releasing and what she was keeping, which were different things, and had always been different things, and which she could finally tell apart. Then she turned. Aldrich crossed the garden directly to her, the way he always moved toward her. Without detour, without the performance of indifference he had told her he had practiced for 20 years and found entirely unconvincing. He looked at the wall, at the wildflower, then at her. He did not ask. She did not explain. He took her hand, and she let him, and they stood together at the eastern wall in the early summer light, in the garden where she had once splinted a bird's wing with a twig and a strip of hem fabric, while a boy she did not know stood watching from the wall and learned, without intending to, something worth keeping. Wolfpack, if you stayed until the very last word, you already know that the bravest thing she ever did was not walking away. It was putting the bag down. Drop your love in the comments and tell me, did Callum's return in Chapter 5 make you furious, or did you see it coming? Like this story, subscribe so you never miss what the Wolfpack gets next, and let's see how far Nadia's story travels.